Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. Okay, continuing with this mini-series on emotion. The guest I am talking to today is Owen Flanagan Jr. Owen is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Duke University. He has his PhD from Boston University. He taught for 16 years at Wellesley College, and then he started working at Duke and teaching there and doing research in '93, where he's still at. And he's the co-director of the Center for Comparative Philosophy. He holds appointments in both psychology and neuroscience and teaches philosophy. And he is the author of the new book, How to Do Things with Emotions: The Morality of Anger and Shame Across Cultures. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. As I've mentioned in many places, I have a really big interest in shame, and I saw Owen's book and I said, I have to read it and I got to talk to him. And he was very gracious enough to come on the podcast and talk with me about his book and his findings. We start out by talking about why he wrote the book and then why he chose anger and shame in the new book. There's some interest, I mentioned it in the conversation, there's some interesting literature that shows that shame and anger have shown to be somewhat connected, which is fascinating. We begin again, as I've said before, about how he defines emotion and what are the distinctions between feelings and affect and emotion. We talk about how emotions are active. We wonder and ponder on whether we can choose our emotions, which naturally leads into the conversation about the social constructivist model of emotions. We give a definition of anger and distinguishing between different types of anger. He talks about why pain passing and payback anger should be significantly minimized. We talk about how do we see emotions across various cultures. He gives an example of two different cultures and how they see shame and anger differently. And kind of as not a case study, but as an example of, people in the West or in certain countries see shame this way, and let's say a negative way, and other countries may see it more positive. Same with anger. Maybe you see negative in some cultures, more positive in other ones. We talk about, how do we develop a better taxonomy of emotions? And maybe there are these umbrella groups of emotions. We talk about shame, understanding shame by understanding the self, and how shame is attached to the global self. One of the areas where I have slowly changed my mind or become kind of thawed out on some of the definitions here is on shame attacking the global self. Using that as a definition seems not as sharp and refined as we once thought it was. And so I don't have any concrete answers on it. It's something I'm still interested in. And so we have a really nice exchange about the self and then how shame attacks the global self or just aspects of the self. And I still think it's, to be understood how that looks like, but it's a very nice exchange. We talk about the difference between emotion and the expression of emotion. We talk about how shame is expressed in pop culture and how it's talked about and written about. And we end with his wonderful idea of how we can have a mature sense of shame. I might say an adaptive sense, meaning a more healthy sense of using shame. Shame isn't all bad. There are some positive aspects to it, or it could be used positively. And that's where we end the conversation. I got to say, Owen was such a nice person, sincerely, and he was so generous with his time and his energy. And, I really like how he's in these different worlds, philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, because it's really helpful in trying to understand or refining the theories we have about emotions, right? We're trying to discuss distinct subjective experiences that people have and that many people have similar experiences. And so how we're trying to organize what those are and to say how they're attached to something we call an emotion is really important, and especially how that looks across many cultures around the world. And so Owen is doing some really, really good work. And so now I bring you Owen Flanagan. I'm here with Owen Flanagan. Owen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very excited to talk to you.
Thank you, Xavier. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So you've written a new book, or it's just released, called "How to Do Things with Emotions: The Morality of Anger and Shame Across Cultures." It's fantastic. It's very, very good. Is this your first popular science book, or is this second, third? Which one is this for you?
Well, I've written, good question. In 2000, I did one book with basic books. This is not my, so that was called The Problem of the Soul, which is about the nature of consciousness and how we think about the mind as both scientifically oriented people and people who care about the nature of mind and consciousness. So that was my only pure trade book. I usually try to write those, Xavier, for sort of crossover audiences because I'm very interested, of course, in different disciplines. So I have to somehow try to make my discussions, legible or accessible to psychologists and anthropologists.
Sure.
And I try to write for a wide public audience. So this is my 10th or 11th or 12th book of that sort.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. We'll tell folks listeners that don't know who you are, just who you are, what your background in, and what you do and what your research is.
Okay, great. So yes, I'm Owen Flanagan. I grew up in the New York metropolitan area, very Catholic identified family. We were also certainly knew we were Irish Catholic.
Yeah.
My previous generations had come over in the potato famines of 1848 and 49 on both sides of my family. And I was always a good student. My daughter sometimes says, "Dad, you always knew your passion." And I tell her that I was good in school and I was shy and I never left.
Mm-hmm.
I still feel good and safe there. Mm-hmm. But I then went to Boston for graduate school. It was a close call between whether I would go on in experimental psychology, which in those days was sort of B.F. Skinner and learning theory, right? Or whether I'd go on in philosophy. I knew I was very interested in human nature, broadly construed, but I went in philosophy. And I continued, though, to do research in philosophy of mind about the mind-body problem, the nature of consciousness, human nature, things like that. I then taught for 16 wonderful years at a wonderful college, Wellesley College in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Yeah. And then in 1993, I moved to Duke, where I've been for the last, must be coming on 30 years. And I'm a member of the philosophy department primarily, but I also have appointments in psychology and neuroscience as well. And yeah.
No, that's wonderful. You know, it's interesting. You and I have a very similar interest. I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and kind of, I was on the other side of the mic, so I was being asked kind of the same questions. And the person asked me, they said, how did you get involved in psychology? I said, well, I took the long way up the mountain. I did not go the direct route. And so I started in theology. Oh. And I'm not in that world anymore, but I studied a lot of theology. And then kind of adjacent to it, I was really into philosophy. I've been reading philosophy since I was a teenager. And still to this day, I still read philosophy very avidly. And obviously took all the philosophy courses I could in undergrad. And so I don't have a degree in philosophy, but it's always kind of been my wheelhouse of sorts. And I read philosophy in my free time, so I'm still a nerd in that way. And then, I did, however many years it was, 7-8 years of clinical psych, and got the doctorate and all that stuff. So, I teach psychology, and I'm a clinician. I, do therapy and stuff. So, but my interests are very much within philosophy and psychology. So it's we have some similar interests there. So,
that's wonderful.
Yeah. So just real quick before we get into the content, why anger and shame? Why did you choose those two emotions to write on?
So great. Well, the answer to the anger part is the easier one. But so let me give one piece of background, because you know this already, but your listeners may want to know it. One of the things that I've been working on, sort of, again, go back to what you and I are both interested in: persons, the nature of human mind, the nature of the mind-body relation. Well, there are traditions that we can, there is a tradition that I was raised to study that inside of, as it were, internal to a certain tradition. And in philosophy, so there's Alfred North Whitehead, who was at the time, I think at Harvard, said the safest generalization to make about Western philosophy is that it's a series of footnotes to Plato.
That's right.
And I was trained in that lineage, and you know that many great universities and great philosophy curriculums will tell you the story where you'll read Plato and Aristotle, and then you get to European philosophy, and then eventually we get to America and Australia. And so for a long time, I was thinking about my questions about what's the nature of a person, what are the emotions like, what are moral norms like in that lineage. And but in the last 10 years or so, something called comparative philosophy has become a thing. And so what comparative philosophy does is it kind of opens up one's perspective to think about how do other philosophical traditions think about such things as human nature, right. The right way to do to structure ourselves politically, the meaning of justice, and so on and so forth. And one thing so that's something I've been doing for a while, and I've been writing books. You again mentioned your own interest, Xavier, in theology. I've been writing books that have sort of required me to go into the connections in various traditions between their theological traditions, say Buddhism, or Confucianism in China, which many people say isn't quite a religion. Okay, but or Taoism in China. So I've been looking at these different, thinking of humans as recipients of not just our own parental sort of training, but our parents as conveyors of different traditions. Now, one of the things that different traditions do that came up for me, and that I've thought a lot about independently of this, is they usually, so Aristotle inside our tradition has this idea, getting the emotions down is simple. You just have to do the emotion in the right way at the right time in the right degree. So you have to just perfectly calibrate, for example, how happy you are to how funny the joke was, or your funny reaction to the funniness of the joke, and then you did it right. Or you have to get angry in just the right way at the right person at the right time, and so on and so forth. Well, but you quickly realize, among other things, that's called the doctrine of the mean. But you quickly realize that other traditions have different ideas about what would be appropriate expression of emotions, decorous behavior, normal behavior even. You think about sort of the examples I always use, and I'm allowed to use, I think, because I'm a native New Yorker, are you just think of the sort of social conventions of New Yorkers, what we call, New Yorkers don't call it rude, but everybody else calls it rude. So one of the things in the background of this whole project is, of course, the question of what can we learn to help our own situation if we get stuck from other traditions, other cultures. So now that takes me to sort of anger. So what I've noticed and been telling my students and my friends for a while is that I've never lived in angrier times. And people will often ask me, well, what about the late 60s and early 70s? And I say, yeah, that's exactly the other time that I would agree. We as a people, Americans, were angry. But the anger then was more hopeful. There was still long form journalism where people listened to each other's sort of, views about things. And there was, we weren't just rat-a-tat-a-tatting in other ways that technologies make possible, tweeting and things like that, our view and stomping our feet in an angry way. We were at least talking, sometimes across angry barriers. But it was the anger of the late 60s and early 70s for the anti-war movement, for civil rights, for feminism, for gay rights, was all with very, very hopeful aspirations, which I think people really felt would come about. It struck me that the anger now is much more infantile. It's a judgmental word, but it was just, mean-spirited people being mean-spirited towards each other. And my friends on the political left and I would be seated towards the political left side, would say to me, "Oh yeah, those effers on the right," and I'd say, "No, you too. Notice what you just did." It would be an angry speech act about those other people,
Right.
And then when I say to people, when I would ask around about that, people would say to me things like, "But that's the nature of anger. That's just the way anger is, and we live in angry times." So my first thought about anger was, the questions of what's sort of statistically normal around here is one question. And yes, our world is a world of heated anger where people are mimicking each other's heated anger, sometimes cruel anger, which we'll talk about, I know, and not listening well. And habits like listening well can be lost. So I thought one thing I could do that might be helpful was explain a little bit about the enormous cultural variation in attitudes to anger, different kinds of anger, the price of anger. Sometimes the prices of anger will be worth it, but there's prices to be paid for anger. So there's cost and benefit analysis, things like that. And so I thought I could best do that by sort of talking about varieties of anger, distinguishing among kinds of anger, calling people's attention to some of the reasons other religious and philosophical traditions have called anger into question, and thinking about whether or not by reflecting on these other traditions, we could rethink how we do anger. Where I think of the doing part is what I emphasize, of course, in the book, which is why the title is there like that. I'm trying to emphasize the aspects of anger that are under control. And as I often say in the book, you know this, I say anger is normative and scripted. You learn how to, as it were, I think actually the feeling of anger is we're also taught how to feel it to a certain extent, although we'll talk about whether there's some underlying phenomenal current or psychobiological current. But certainly how we convey our angry attitudes are entirely culturally scripted. And that's where one gets in leverage and the possibility of moral change. And that's what I was interested on the anger side. So that's the answer on the anger side.
On the shame side, yeah. How did we get to? How did you decide to put shame with the anger piece? You could have just written the book on anger, and
In my previous book, I spent I did a lot of historical work on anger. So if I put those two together, I have a great big fat book on anger. You're right.
Right. Yeah.
So why did I think about shame? Well, I was thinking also certain things started to happen. Now the shame side, and this is why I'm so delighted to talk to you, who's an expert on shame. That part is the newer part for me, and it's where I have less expertise, and I'm more hunting around my intuitions. But here's the background: when I started to teach courses on world or global philosophy, as we're now calling it, and I try to have my students learn about the traditions that are not just in that lineage from Plato, footnotes to Plato lineage, but in the lineages of Buddha or Confucius or African religions, I started to see that shame was all over the place as a perfectly reasonable and acceptable sort of emotion.
Yeah.
I knew from the anthropological literature that, the general view among anthropologists or cultural psychologists is that every culture uses one or more socializing emotions, and we'll talk, some use anger, some use guilt, some use shame. But I was sort of struck by the degree to which almost everywhere else that I looked, shame had a fairly high status. It wasn't thought to be completely without problems, but it had a high status as something, and a sense of shame had a high status as something that a good person has. So I started to think about what might be the difference between a sense of shame and conscience as we conceive it. But I was also worried all along about what I saw as a kind of shamelessness, which I never expected to see so culturally transparent. And what I have in just mind there is that people who were careless with the truth, who just didn't seem to care about the truth. That puzzled me. And I thought, well, there's something inner missing, because most of us at least would have a guilty conscience or feel ashamed. But I started to see many people in public offices, But some people influenced by weird views like postmodernist views about irony and things.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was aware of, meanwhile, this bad rap that shame had in our culture as the cause of all kinds of psychological maladies of the sort that you would be dealing with. And I just thought I wanted to explore it more. So I spent the year before I started to write the book, I spent at Stanford at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. And that was the year I read everything that I hadn't read on the anthropology and cross-cultural psychology of anger. And then I also studied as much as I could get my handle on about cross-cultural theorizing and thinking about shame. So on the anger side, there's way too much anger and it's causing us problems. On the shame side, maybe there's not enough. At least there's not a mature sense of shame that we ought to have.
Yeah, no, that's great. You know, it's interesting. When I first got the book, I saw anger and shame, and it made sense to me. Some people may or may not know this, but the literature has shown in various points that typically there was for a while, we'll get into this, but for a while, many people thought that guilt and shame were synonymous terms for the same emotion. And then there was a lot of research that was done, and it said, well, they're distinct emotions. They're distinct, they're separate. And so guilt is something that you do, it's something that you feel when you do something wrong. And it usually leads to reparative action, right? I steal the candy bar. I feel guilty. Let me go and give it back or pay or something. Yep. Shame, now this will depend on what your definition of shame is, which we'll talk about as well. Traditionally, it's been said that it's has to deal with some sense of the self, of how one views the self. And so they view it as not changeable. Oh, this is something I did. This is some part of me. And I can't really just easily fix that. So shame has shown in many points in the literature that it leads to anger. And so there is this, because you can't do anything to fix it like you do with guilt. So I'm a horrible person, or this part of me is horrible because I stole the candy bar. So I feel shame about it. And now I'm just angry at myself. And maybe I'm angry at other situations. And so there is this interesting linkage between anger and shame. Now, there's lots and lots of research continuing to be done on shame, and so we're continuing to update this as we'll discuss on the adaptive pieces of shame, which is something that I feel moderately passionate about, and so I think we have a lot of convergence there, so that will be fun to get into. So let's start with the big question here, right? So we're going to do a little bit of some groundwork first, and then get into the specifics. How do you define emotion, and how do you make that distinction between feelings, emotion, and affect?
So the general view on so we start with something like affect. So the sort of framework, the background framework, and I don't take position on all questions that, say, a psychologist might take a position on because I'm primarily a philosopher. Mm-hmm. But I more or less go with sort of conventional ways of thinking about affect. And there, I'm primarily thinking, for purposes of my book, that affects come in positive and negative sort of valence. So there are positive feeling states, positive states and negative states. And they feel negatively to, as it were, the owner of them, the person who's had it. Mm-hmm. The feelings themselves. So here's where it's very helpful that you're asking this question up front, because it's important that I sort of point out that I actually think that for different intellectual purposes, one could have different definitions of emotion. So I think there's what I'll call, in the philosophy of mind, we actually have a lot of discussion about what we call defining mental states narrowly or widely. You'll see what I mean. So narrow, so sometimes people think, let's say, and I'm with people like this in neuroscience all the time. So neuroscientists might think, when I talk about anger, I'm interested in the activation of the brain that presumably subserves, or is even, the feeling, the sort of phenomenal feel, the way it seems to be angry in the purely inner sense. So it doesn't take into account, as it were, actually what's causing the anger. It's just, I get in a long line at Starbucks, I feel angry. Okay, so some people would identify the emotion with that narrow feeling state. And then, of course, neuroscientists have sometimes thought, well, what hopefully a science of the mind will eventually do is sort of do a neural profile of that narrow state. And it will have a distinctive neural profile that will be distinct from, say, when I feel happy, and or when I feel fear. And you might say, now, isn't it interesting? Because we do think that we can distinguish between states that both have negative affective valence, like fear and anger are both effectively negative. But I don't get usually confused. If I see the rattlesnake on the side of the road, I'm scared, not angry. Right. If you cut me off in traffic, I'm angry, not scared. Although sometimes we get confused about it. So you might imagine, so one way to think about emotional states would just be to be interested in sort of, as it were, their narrow neurobiological somatic profile. And, as you know, someone like Paul Ekman, who did, when he did his wonderful early work on, so he followed a hint that was in Darwin, in the expression of emotions in the face of man and animals, that and of course, Paul's story is fascinating because he was a student of Margaret Mead. And Margaret Mead thought that there couldn't possibly be universal expressions. And she sent Paul off to find out that she was right and Darwin was wrong. And Paul kept coming back with evidence that, gee, people seem to move the same, facial muscles, and we get certain similar profiles across. So when they make an angry face, we get fingers get warmer at the fingertips. There's characteristic blood profiles, and eventually you could imagine that there'd be a neural profile associated with that. Now, so you could define and look at just emotional feelings, states. I think one could define emotions that way and say, that's all I'm interested in looking at, the sort of phenomenal inner profile. I'm much more interested, for my purposes, in thinking through sort of the way emotions work in ecologically sort of standard contexts. And I think there we're better off with what I call a wide conception. And by that, I just mean this. When the child falls and scrapes its knee, we don't see its sadness, we see its tears. But we teach the word sad. Eventually the word sad hooks onto, or hurt, actually. And this is why I say emotion terms are theoretical terms, not observation terms. Like when we teach the child tree, we point to a tree, they look at the tree, and we're all on board with that's a tree, damn it. When we teach a child the language of private events in general, but emotions in particular, they're almost always introduced in certain contexts where we see a cause, the child falling down and scraping its knee, or the hamster died, or I didn't get enough M&Ms, and we infer, because the child is similar to us, that the child is in a state that we in our verbal community call sad or hurt or whatever. So I think of us, it's because we introduce these terms in complex situational contexts, and we also care a lot about what the child does when she's sad. We introduce norms for feeling even. We say, oh, no, it doesn't hurt that much. The boo-boo doesn't hurt that much. We're actually indicating to the child right out of the gate that this doesn't warrant that kind of fussing. It's actually kind of an Aristotelian doctrine of the mean right out of the gate, right? And so we teach the child these both norms of what situations make it appropriate for you to have that feeling state with those associated behaviors. The reason I'd like to define the emotions in this broad way that includes the feeling state in the middle, but it involves their causes, the feeling states, and the behaviors, or the dispositions to behave. I might not even need the behaviors. That is, what I want to do when I feel such and so, is because that is the part that I think we need to focus on when we worry about such things as, is our anger appropriate? The feeling of anger, as it were, is just what it is. But you might say, as we adults, I'm often struck by the student gets in a line at the Starbucks. It's a long line. I see her huffing and puffing. She comes back to her friends afterwards and she said, I couldn't believe it. The fucking guy in front of me, he ordered a triple macchiato with virgin coconut shavings and he paid for a check. And her friends hug her and say, it'll be okay. I know, isn't that terrible? And you think, there's something wrong here. Right? God didn't create the universe so that you get everything you want right out of the gate. There are lines at Starbucks. And so looking at the causes, we can adjust our feelings towards certain causes if it needs be, if it's inappropriate. And sometimes, the dramatic overflow there, it's not an anger overflow, but it's aren't I a wounded person overflow. They're connected. And I think that so one can think about where you can get leverage when you're having emotions which are just kind of self-indulgent or over the top or cruel or mean. You can really get leverage if you change your attitude towards the causes sometimes, and if you change your attitudes at the effect side. So the conception of emotions is wide in that sense. And I call it the conception I'm using as opposed to a definition of emotion.
I think I would agree with you mostly on the kind of what you're saying, this kind of wide lens of how we define emotion. I kind of hold the standard view, although I'm not married to it, but the standard view from what I hear from many people is that emotions are different from affect and feelings in a variety of ways, but that emotions have an affective component, a behavioral component, and a cognitive component, right? Because it's almost like an emotion is almost like a system, because you're going to think about certain things, you're going to feel certain things, and you're going to do certain things, essentially, is what, and emotions are implicated in all of those. Now, those things are separate, right? So the physiological response, the feelings, that's not an emotion. That's a component that could be connected. That, when people colloquially will say, well, I feel angry, right? Yes, there's the rush of blood to your head, or and you get sweaty palms if you're nervous, or there's the physiological pieces of it, sure, but that's not exclusively an emotion. There's the affective, your countenance, your demeanor. And yes, there's the positive, negative valences that can happen, but that's not only anger. And then there's what you do, right? Now, I definitely agree that emotions are, kind of positioned towards an active type of thing, right? The way I usually tease this out is emotions don't tell you what to do, but they tell you that you have to or should do something, is usually how I think of it, right? So if I get upset, well, it's not telling me, you should throw the ball at the wall and just let it out, right? That's a behavior, which is different, but it is saying there's something that's activating you, right? There's this thing that's, you need to make sure you're at a basic evolutionary level, feel safe, feel protected, or for others that you care about. I mean, this stuff gets very abstract, but at a basic level, you got to do something, right? To me, emotions, not exclusively, but emotions are kind of like the fire detector or smoke detector rather in your house, right? There's, goes off, you should do something, you should check this out, you should see what's going on and do something about it, right? And I think that at a basic level, that's what they're doing, but there's kind of layers to it, which it just sounds like that's your kind of wide lens way of framing it is, just kind of saying the same thing in different terms. But I like your conceptualization of the kind of narrow and wide.
The reason I say, I sometimes use that language similar to what you were using. I say that, so there's the affective, cognitive. Yeah, my theory is a cognitive theory. So the person sees the snake as scary,
right?
And feels certain ways, and that leads to dispositions to behavior. In that case, just like you said, you need to head for the hills. Now, which way you head, up, down, sideways, or whatever. And it may even, I'm still open to this, and I wasn't sure from what you were just saying, Xavier, how you think about this. It does seem like the reason I like to include the causes of an emotion, even in the emotional enactments, is that this does have to do a certain extent with what we know about the sort of speed of reaction of a nervous system. But there is the seeing the you're hiking and you see a string on the ground as the rattlesnake and are scared. I mean, these kind of cognitive mistakes. So that's the alarm bells, the smoke detector going off, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
So you appropriate even the cause as worthy of fright, and you are frightened to it. So you bring the cause into it, and then of course, sometimes you can phenomenologically, at least humans can detect phenomenologically what we want to do when we're in a certain emotional state without actually doing it. And
Yeah.
sure, you have to deal with patients all the time. So for example, one of the interesting things that I turned up when I was looking into this or cross-cultural stuff on anger is for Americans, among the top 3 causes, I think it's top 3 of anger, and it doesn't appear on the top 10 of any other culture's list, is wasting my fucking time. And it has to be said that way because people,
yes.
It's like my time,
Yes.
I possess it and I'm already angry that you're messing with it.
Yes.
And it's just fascinating that something like, so that's a good example of where there's real cultural particularity. Whereas otherwise I might say, well, let's talk for the next 2 hours. And the other one is a disposition to behavior. So anger, for example, this from when you were a student, anger is almost always classified as an approach emotion.
Yeah.
You want to do something. I want to go, you got me angry, I'm after you. And Americans do say very often that they want to punch a person. They never do it, luckily, but they want to do that. And that's a sort of paradigmatic approach emotion. But Japanese never say that.
Right.
They want to leave the room. So there's one reason I kind of like, if I can, to thread the needle that you were talking about, is bringing in the causes and effects, because that's where you just start to see what people have tampered with in creating different norms and scripts for doing emotions is sometimes the reaction to certain types of causes and the dispositions to engage in certain effects. In different ways.
Yeah, you make the claim, right, that emotions are things we do, right? And kind of what you were saying with the example with, someone falls off a bike and they cry about it or whatever, So how do you distinguish then in that way this difference between an emotion and a behavior, right? So there, as we were just saying, there might be a behavioral component to an emotion, but it is not, people will say, I throw the water bottle across the room because I'm angry. And they'll say that's anger, right? Yeah. But that's the behavior. That's not the emotion. So how do we make this distinction between behavior and the emotion if emotions are things we do, which is very active?
So I guess what I want to do is, emotions are things we do is a motto, you might say, as opposed to a thesis that I will, defend and die in the last ditch for. It's partly, Xavier, to make room for the thing that you emphasized at the beginning, that because you and I think of emotions very much the same way. I mean, there's got to be a natural history of these things. They're ubiquitous. Many of them look to have universal character. We'll get to that, of course. Besides their culturally specific character. And they sure do look like they are the fire alarm systems, as you say, or the well, you better keep going after this because it's really good for you system. There are 2 different kinds of systems, the positive and negative ones. And so they look to be evolutionarily just beautifully adapted to a world in which there's lots of danger. So you want a system that gets surprised at the right times in the right places. You want one that gets scared at the right times in the right places. You want one that gets angry when you try to steal my mate or my food and goes after you with sticks and stone, etc. And you want, when there's love and friendship, for the person to want to go back for more, when there's food, and so you get that. You know this. So the idea is that Mother Nature didn't give us the emotions because she thought we'd enjoy a bright inner life. She gave them to us to dispose us to do certain things. And so one could, again, go narrow and just say, for purposes of my analysis, I'm going to separate out the feeling part, and I'm going to call that the emotion proper. One could do that. I don't think there'd be like a huge theoretical objection to doing that. But in some cases, the acting out the emotion both feels as if it's still part of expressing or feeling and expressing the emotion can feel unified in a certain way. I mean, loving gestures or loving touches can be part and parcel of the feeling of love. And it may just be that in some cases we do want to separate. I mean, clearly in cases like, you hurt me, I'm really angry, and now I'm going to get revenge next month when I get my chance. That's got to be a separate behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But in some cases, I'm sort of in favor of thinking of, it goes back to people like James and Dewey and early thinkers about the emotions. We just might want to think of phenomenal that the episodes that involve being scared of the snake and running from it is more unified than we think.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think of the different components, not only the three inner components that you mentioned, the affective, the feeling, and the cognitive, but also what causes them. In some case, maybe they're natural evolutionary causes or triggers, and the natural behaviors that they lead to, and then that getting widened. We can think about it as a system in which, if we want to change anything, we could think about all those different locations as possible sites where we could, as a culture, maybe tamper with things. Or, I mean, maybe just with the neurochemistry in certain cases. That's sort of the idea of why I'm favoring this wide look. The proof will be in the pudding of whether it's helpful or not.
Yeah. I guess the one thing with that, I don't entirely disagree with that. I guess the one thing I'm thinking about here is, well, many of those things in terms of, we use the common one, the snake and the fear. Yeah. Is, you jump or you run away or whatever, you hit it or whatever the action is, right? I agree with you on that, but so this might be splitting hairs, but if I do think they're distinct enough, and they should be distinct enough, because there are different moments where we do need that processing, right? So for example, if I'm worried that, someone's going to break in my house and I start, I sleep with a gun by me and someone comes into my door and I just have the fear, I shoot the person and it's, my cousin that just came in or whatever, right? That would be very catastrophic, right? So there is a distinction, I think, between, the emotion, right? But I think a lot of the times in the moment, you need it to be quick. You need it to be almost instantaneously. But my question here is, yes, emotions are things that we do, but how do we look at that as different from a kind of reactionary, reflexive response to that kind of thing, right? Like, how do we have emotions as, yes, these things are active and we should do things, but they're not just, involuntary impulses. Right.
Well, good. Yeah. I mean, so you're hitting upon a lot of the, so I don't think it's splitting hairs. I think these are very, very important things. The history of course, until around 1879, we philosophers were the people who studied the emotions, and then you psychologists started to do it.
Yes.
Some of these debates, these issues that you're pointing out, these are not merely semantic, as you say. I mean, Descartes had the idea that the emotions, which he called passions, were triggered and were entirely just like reflexes or pupil contractions of your eyes. Now, if you take that kind of model and then start to include the behaviors as also reflexive or triggered, then you've got a problem, because then you shot your cousin and there's no responsibility whatsoever. And, we're off to, it's the end of the world as we know it. So we don't want to go down that route. Descartes did have the interesting idea, though, that I think we should all believe to a certain extent. Some of these reactions, there was the question, when I was a little boy, we were told that we were guilty of our thoughts as much as our behaviors. Mm-hmm. So little Catholic boys in my day used to have to confess impure thoughts or impure desires or impure emotions, I think. Descartes went so far as to say you shouldn't have to confess. He didn't put it this way, but his view was such that you shouldn't have to confess them because you're not responsible. So if you want to kill Owen right now, Xavier, that's not a problem. Maybe you should see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but as long as you don't do it. But one of the reasons I want to play with for as long as I can, this idea that these things are linked up. It would be a bad idea to raise children to think that if they get scared, they can go and do bad things to whoever scared them. But I think we have a lot more I think our emotions are not normally, for mature people, adults, triggered in any interesting reflexive way. So I actually think the feelings we have might just be under as much voluntary control as the behaviors that those feelings reveal. And that's in a way why I still want to say we might just still be confused and not have the taxonomy right. So let's think about this way in which we think through more carefully the connections among what look to be, at least for now, different components. I'm happy for them to be different components of a system, that the causes, the affect, the feeling, the emotional feeling itself, and the behaviors are different components. But I want to sort of see if we can keep them under something like the concept of emotional episodes. I often use that concept as opposed to emotions.
Yeah. No, I like that. That makes sense. I do think, yes, when this stuff becomes really tricky, because, as you start to like kind of pull that thread out, you start to see all of these different kind of this variance and nuance and things like that. And so, yes, I definitely think there are components to it, but we do want to also keep in mind their kind of how they're integrated.
Right. One thing that might just be an interesting example to your listeners, and you might be interested too. So in 2000, I was invited with a small group of other scientists. They were mostly scientists, and to spend a week with the Dalai Lama discussing destructive emotions. And there's a book about this with Dan Goldman wrote called Destructive Emotions and How to Overcome Them. Yeah. And Paul Ekman was there, and Paul and I are friends. And I remember after the second day in Dharamsala, Paul said to me, maybe there were other people there, but he said, "This is unbelievable." He said, because I've studied emotions my whole life. And he said, "I think these Tibetan Buddhists think that he said, I always knew that you could control what you, Xavier, are calling the behavior." Like Paul knew, like we all know, I could get angry, but not reveal it. It might be hard, but I cannot reveal it. He said, "I think these people really believe, the Tibetan Buddhists believe, that they can not feel anger in situations which they were raised to feel anger in." So that's part of the sort of rationale here. I don't know if they're right about that. I want to leave it as an open hypothesis, though, that just as much as we can control and adjust our behaviors that we express emotionally, we'll say that, we also might be able to actually change our relation to the feelings, the affective and feeling components, and the cognitive components, such that certain causes which used to get us angry don't have to get us angry anymore. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's sort of the field I want to sort of mess in for now.
I hear that. I think this component of it is, it's interesting. I have to think about this. I haven't thought about this part of it. This really just gets wrapped up into the which camp you're on with the free will argument. And for those that are kind of deterministic kind of viewpoint, there's no free will, etc., are going to say probably not. And for those that are kind of the compatibilists, Dan Dennett view, you're going to say, yeah, sure, of course. So if you're going to swim in those waters, you'll probably just have to get to. Most people most people debate or discuss this at the cognitive level. Can you control your thoughts? Can you control what's, I don't know what, next sentence I'm going to say, etc. And not a lot, as is usual, people think about, well, what about the feelings piece of it? And so I would imagine that's where those waters take you.
One place the waters take you, though, one thing, without getting, I had once said in a book that I wrote in 2000, I said, if I was in charge of philosophy, I would forbid discussion of free will and determinism for 100 years.
Yes, it starts to become an argument of definitions at a certain point.
No, but the good thing about the way I'm thinking about the emotions would be, I think one can avoid, one has to accept certain things like plasticity and even determinists. I don't want to get into that discussion, the one you were not asking me to get into, but as long as I don't think, this is something you no doubt have thought really deeply about, and I have not thought deeply about it at all, namely how individuals leverage the emotional economy of their lives. This is your business. You pay the big bucks for that. What I've been noticing is, what I've been just thinking about is as I look around at different cultures and how they have theorized and inculcated in their kids the ways of doing the emotions, I see huge variation. That at least means that there could be ways social structures are set up that could change the emotional and ethical ecology in a way that people do the emotions differently. So it may not be that you can do it yourself to yourself, but you might be able to think about how to create role models, social environments, which do less incentivizing of following and emulating people who are not worthy of of using them as models for good emotional behavior.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with that. I think that there is a difference between the individual and then when you're scaling. This becomes a scaling problem. This is not just with thoughts and feelings and behaviors, but this is also a challenge with politics and social issues and things like that as well. So I do agree. I think there's an important distinction there. There's two other kind of just beginning things before we jump into the actual emotions themselves, which are how you think of positive versus negative emotions. This is colloquially termed in books. This is used in the psychological literature. What are your thoughts on this? These are positive emotions and these are negative emotions. Do you have any ideas about that taxonomy?
Well, yeah, I think that there are two different senses of positive and negative, right? Speaking just straightforwardly. One is just, do they feel positively or negatively? That is, there's their valence, positive or negative. And if you run it that way, then first pass simplistically, you could take some list of basic emotions and say, well, here are the ones that typically feel, because we have to say typically because they're not universally so, that anger feels negatively, fear feels negative, sadness feels negative, surprise is probably neutral but can go either way. Good surprises and bad surprises. And then, happy, love, these will be the positive balance. Now, if you love money, though, and will do anything for money, then a philosopher, and anyone who does normative moral theory, will say there's a problem, and that's a negative emotion. You have a negative emotional attachment. I'm assuming, overly attached to money. I don't just mean a normal sense of money. Or if you're sad, if you're sad about, well, you could, there can be a sadness that is kind of a complicated admixture of great love and loyalty, and it can feel exactly the right emotion, and overall have a positive, both be positively normative from a moral point of view. It's appropriate to the situation. And it's not about some trivial matter, and can feel uplifting and beautiful. So these things go every which way. If you just do the pure psychological sort of hedonic plus minus, they'll go one way. But what classical philosophical texts, sort of classical Buddhist texts that go back to the 5th century BCE, Confucian texts, and Greek philosophical texts, they all, when they talk about emotional states, they all make it clear that they think that whether a state is good or bad, right or wrong, will depend on its content, what it's about, as well as whether it's positive or negative hedonically.
Yeah.
So that would, yeah.
I think I mostly agree here. So the way I say this is no, I don't think there's positive and negative emotions. I understand what people mean by that.
Yeah.
I typically see emotions as neutral. Because what happens for folks is they start to see these as the bad emotions and the good emotions. And eventually that does scale in pop culture as shame's the bad emotion, anger is the bad emotion. And I think that's incorrect. And I think it's indirectly harmful in the long scheme of things, because you're going to have people that are going to have these, we'll say, emotional states, and they're walking around thinking that it's bad and they got to get rid of it. And I think that's really harmful and dangerous, as opposed to, no. These are emotions, and emotions are useful. They cannot feel good, but the emotion can be useful, or there's a reason why the emotion is happening. And of course we can talk about positive, negative valence, et cetera. But so, I think there's times where, anger is is adaptive, and I think it can be very useful. The same with shame, same with guilt, joy, sadness, and so I usually resist the positive negative. I know what people mean by it, but I think
I don't ever deal with patients, so I don't have to deal with it in that, because I totally can see what you're saying. I would never want to, with a friend, I would never say, oh, your anxiety, I wouldn't, it is what it is. And then one deals with the person from there. One can see how, of course, there are, and this is not necessarily the kind of emotional states I'm talking about, but it must be, again, something that I have no clue as to how to deal with, but that you do all the time. People who are in long-term emotional states of a depressive sort or something like that. And those are no doubt painful. And sometimes the person understands the causes, and sometimes perhaps they have no interesting causes. They're sort of, biochemical weather within, God knows, right? So we're just, So in terms of just sort of technical, sort of usage of the term, I would just use, I usually, so we totally agree with that.
I was going to ask this other bit here on this is it kind of ties into it. So I think you mentioned in the book, you describe in some affinity to Lisa Feldman Barrett, she's the big giant in the field here. I think Joe Ledoux, he's the other big guy here with the social construction model of emotions. And you can give the kind of 30-second overview of it if you want, but basic idea is that emotions a strict constructionist view would say emotions don't really exist of sorts. I don't know if they'd say it that way, but they're all constructs, right? They're all things, they're all tools, labels that we give to something, but you create it, and you create it in your mind, you create it in this context, and other people are going to create it in a different way. And so we can't just have this universal kind of thing, because it's all going to be different based on norms and culture and morals. So, and you can correct me if there's a better way of explaining that, but how do you kind of sit with this and are there no universal emotions, no basic emotions, stuff like that?
Yeah, good. No, so I don't take I have some sympathy with some of the things that Lisa and Joe write about. Actually, neither of them has ever done the sort of interesting cross-cultural work that I think developing their thesis would depend on. And there are some people who've done it much better. Yeah. So Joe Ledoux, as you know, Joe's work has always been really with rats for the most part. Right. And Joe's basic idea, whereas other people who worked with rats like Pansky, he was really good at believing that, of course, rats have emotions because they're mammals just like us, and there were this behavioral circuitry that revealed that they have these sort of basic emotions, something like an Ekman list, we'll say. And then Ledoux comes along and he says, well, no, what they have is survival circuitry, and the survival circuitry of, let's say, fear is unconscious. It just means that the animal, if they're not human, will try to escape from the rattlesnake. But they don't consciously feel anything. In the human community, that survival circuitry is lower brain, but then there's higher brain centers that the adults teach the kid to learn that what they're doing is fearing, and then that builds up a kind of. I think I don't have any reason to accept that view. What I do think goes on is probably it sure looks like for some set of emotions, and I would think there that you're going to come up with more or less an Ekman type list. It's going to be anger, fear, sadness, surprise, happy. I don't know. He's up to 7. He thinks contempt, I think, is on there. Disgust, maybe. I forget. I talked to Jessica Tracy, earlier this year, and she makes a very convincing case that pride is a universal emotion as well. Interesting. Basic emotion. Well, good. And actually, someone like Tracy is important because, after all, if there are basic emotions, it isn't that all Ekman was looking for was the ones that are revealed on the face. There could easily be ones that are revealed not on the face, but in other ways.
In the body, yeah.
But in the body. Or take something like sexual jealousy. That seems like a good one to be universal. It's certainly not a face for it. but
Right.
there's
Yeah.
a lot of phenomenological evidence, and you see it among animals, that there's expressions of sexual jealousy. Shame, some people say, well, that's not on a list of basic emotions. But then again, making yourself smaller and diminishing your size among animals is often a signal that you're deferring to a larger, becoming more diminutive and shrinking away. So I don't have any trouble with the idea that there's basic circuitry that involves activation, sort of standard triggers for a certain set of responses of some subset of emotions. Now, how they're blended together in a language, though, I am very interested in the sort of semantics and how these linguistically connect up with each other.
Sure.
And so what one does find once one, looks across languages, that the problems of intertranslating emotion words across languages are formidable.
Yes.
And
yes.
so even if there's sort of something, and of course, philosophers love to make distinctions. So we don't mind if there are 8 different kinds of sadness in American English that kids understand and that adults understand, but we just don't parse them. We don't call them, sadness 1, sadness 2, sadness 3. We just know that there's this family resemblance among them. They all might be built out of the same basic underlying equipment. I have no trouble with that, but there's vast space to sort of construct them beyond that and to embed them in cultural norms and systems. So it's to that extent that I almost always hold, people have often written about my work. They say Flanagan holds very reasonable, moderate, hybrid theories of things. And I think that's a good thing. Although sometimes people say, you should.
Yeah, you got to pick a side.
I don't know enough to whether,
right, sure.
I don't think that I have to be on Ledoux or Barrett Feldman's side of.
Yeah.
No.
So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about anger. So, how do you define anger? You talk about the 2 types, payback and pain passing, and why we probably should, if not get rid of them, really diminish them. So tell us about what anger is, and then how these kind of 2 types and why they're not so good for us.
So what I do in the book, maybe the way to tell you what anger is, on my view, is to tell you how I distinguish. I'm sort of, I sort of invite the audience in for a conversation and say, so the first pass thing, and in fact, it helps me if there are something like basic emotions, or we generally know what we're talking about when we talk about anger. So I invite the reader in to think about the following topic. First of all, sort of what role does anger play in your life? And then I suggest, without defining it, this idea that you might think about the role anger plays in 3 different spheres of your life, first of all. So I call anger in the personal sphere. That would be the sort of the way in which you enact anger, if you do at all, in your relations with your loved ones, your family, your friends, your children. Often people will immediately recognize that the way they enact anger in those relationships is hierarchical, for example. Like parents are allowed to get mad at children, but children aren't allowed to get mad back at parents. They sometimes will find it sexist, but I leave that for personal, examination. Then there's the middle sphere. Martha Nussbaum writes about anger very well. And the middle sphere she has in mind are relations with like the cable TV company or, the people, your credit card company, or, the people you meet in commercial activity, the barista who you buy coffee from, and so on and so forth. Or the company that you pay your loans to for your mortgage or your car. And then there's anger in the political sphere. And I often ask audiences, I'll say to young people, I'll say, as you think about anger in the personal sphere of life, like how you are towards friends and loved ones, to what degree do you think that your anger, upon reflection, what would you say your win-loss percentage is? Like how often when you get mad at your roommate or your partner or your spouse, do you get what you want? That's an interesting question about any emotion, or especially about the expression of emotions, right? Because if there are systems to alert us to when things of high value are at stake, you want to be on the winning side. So, and then I also ask a different question. how do you feel about yourself morally after you get angry at a friend or a loved one? Like, that is, do you pass moral inspection? Because you can imagine getting what you wanted, like the person shares the second half of the M&Ms with you, but you told them that they were a selfish bitch, and therefore you think less of yourself, and so on and so forth.
It would depend. Okay. It would depend on your morals, right? Because if you have an idea of fairness, well, that's going to look different for different people. So
yep, you got it totally right. So I don't ask them to tell me what their morals are. I just want, but again, one would think, in fact, it almost is certainly the case, that most people, no matter what their morals are, prefer to pass their own self-inspection.
Yes.
They prefer to look morally good to themselves. So that's why it's kind of a good question.
Yes.
And what I find right away among at least young people is they'll say, anger doesn't work out too well. I often don't feel good about myself for what I said when I was angry to someone. You know, Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher, says, the trouble with anger is you can't domesticate it very well. It always it concerns itself with what is not in focus. You know, imagine you and I are roommates, you know, I say to you, damn it, can't you finally wash the dishes? You know, and then I find myself saying something about, I don't know, your funny eyeglasses. And I wish I didn't say that, because why did I have to say that? You know, it was all about the dishes, but now it's about your eyeglasses. Anyway, and then the political sphere of anger. But anyway, you could think about anger in those different spheres. Then there's different kinds of anger. And the two kinds of anger, so I distinguish between the following kinds of anger. One is that I call pain-passing anger, payback anger. Payback anger is anger that's authorized by Aristotle, for example. So, you know, in philosophy, he's maybe like Moses is in the Abrahamic religions. You know, so Aristotle says that anger is appropriate when a person does one of three things to me. If they show contempt for me, okay, think about when both Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney referred to the opposition voters as deplorables. I think they both used something like that word. That's a way of showing contempt. Then spite. You throw away the other M&Ms, not because you just throw them away to keep me from having them. That's spiting me. And then there's what's called arrogant abuse, and that's when you shame or embarrass me. And Aristotle says, if someone does that to you, then you will want to, it's two interesting moves here, you'll want to get revenge on them, and you should get revenge on them. And that's part of being a reasonable human being, at least in Athens at the 4th century BCE. And so this is part of what you just might call conventional Greek morality at that time. So I think that kind of anger there's a lot of that around. People want to hurt other people. They often do it from the cowardly pose of being on social media, where they call someone out and say terrible things about them, or try to humiliate them or embarrass them or hurt their reputation. And then, of course, that person may well want to get back at them and may strategize how to do so. And it's Hatfields and McCoys, but in the 21st century way of a revenge. So I think that's a kind of anger that if you reflect on it, maybe someone would think that's something I should try to avoid if possible. And why should you do that? Well, that would be a complicated discussion of ethics. But usually the thought is, at least in ethical theory, that ethics aims at the good, a moral life aims at the good, and therefore, instead of getting revenge on someone, I should want to improve them. Now, I may not be positioned to improve them, so I may just need to walk away, but nonetheless, getting revenge may not be always the best thing, at least as cycles of revenge and so on. So that's one kind of anger that I think is very common in the modern world. Another kind of anger that I think is also common in the modern world and is actually somewhat authorized, whereas the first kind of anger is authorized by Aristotle. The second kind is kind of authorized by a movement. You're sufficiently younger than me that you may not remember primal scream therapy. Did you ever hear of it?
Not that I can say confidently
Well,
on.
so this was like a lot of other things. There were certain ideas in the late '60s that no one should know about, so I shouldn't have mentioned primal scream. But primal scream therapy was by this guy named, I think his name was Yanov, Yanov, a humanistic psychologist. It was roughly the idea that when you came into the world, you let it all out. You were screaming. You came into the world, as a baby, and you cried. First thing you did was cry. Then the whole world tells you can't cry anymore. Well, you need to cry. You need to scream. You need to get out all your agony. And this leads to what I think is Carol Travis calls the ventilationist view of human emotions, which I think is a very dangerous view that all of us at all times need to be expressing our emotions as authentically as possible. Now, in the case of anger, this leads to what the ventilationist view leads to is what I call pain passing anger, where a person will be angry, but not at you, but they pass anger to you because they're angry. Mm-hmm. They just kind of give as a free gift to the world and to all those around him their anger.
These are the Freudian concepts of displacement and projection.
Exactly. So you have very much a similar situation of hydraulic model of human emotions and human interior life, and unless you let it out, the dam will bust open some way, or you will become very, very psychologically messed up.
Catharsis theory was another one, which was like you got to get it all out. You just got to this cathartic way, and then you'll be fine. Yeah.
So I think we to reflect on that kind of anger, we would see that's not something you should be very proud of doing. I mean, and sometimes this happens. We're all in bad moods. And your friend, my friend Xavier might say to me, "Owen, you seem in a pissy mood today." And then I realize, well, I am in a pissy mood today, but I'm making him feel bad because I'm in a pissy mood today. And I shouldn't be doing that because, I should just leave the room, go someplace else. But I think those two, if you start sort of breaking up kinds of anger and you think about them one by one, you can start to see where you might start to engage in some action, possibly self-cultivation action, therapeutic action. Now, there are plenty of other kinds of anger, like social justice anger, recognition, respect anger, that I think are totally appropriate. And the overall argument, which I can't give here on the show, is that pain-passing anger and payback anger are both bad. That is, in certain situations, they're not, but they're generally bad. A good person shouldn't want to engage in them very much, if at all. And it would be better also when you engage in recognition, respect anger for, say, Black Lives Matter causes or for any kind of social justice movement, you also try to improve the situation and the other person, not to get revenge on them or pass pain to them. Mm-hmm. This is something in different language that Martin Luther King Jr. was all about.
Some people see it as like a type of righteous anger, right? I'm upset at this kind of injustice, right? Whether it's some type of discriminatory kinds of thing at a social level, or if it's someone walks past the old lady and just pushes go on the elevator and doesn't let her go up or something like that. It's just some kind of like, hey, that's not right. That kind of thing. So.
Exactly. Yeah, and anger in those situations seems totally appropriate. Mm-hmm. And saying it's not right is a way of trying to call attention to the injustice and get the other person not to do it again, to improve themselves, not to have those dispositions.
Right. And just to, kind of tie that up is again, kind of this active principle, but the anger in that sense is adaptive in those ways, right? It's the emotion or the feeling to say, hey, that's not right. You should do something about it, or something should be done about this. Less likely to happen, or maybe it would be different or more difficult if you didn't have the feeling of anger, right? And this is kind of the adaptive form of anger.
It's an extremely useful part of our human nature that we can utilize in this very positive way.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, notice there, you're no longer using adaptive exactly in the sense of biological adaptation. You're now using it in sense of because it might get you killed. I mean, saying that you're using it in the sense of now we use this tool for human flourishing, for doing better in our world, not just for the ends of fitness. But yes, it's equipment that Mother Nature gave us that is incredibly useful in contexts like that.
Yeah. So let's kind of let's tie this in for the conversation we were talking about earlier. You can introduce it here if you'd like, or I can just kind of ask the question here. But, how do we look at anger universally, cross-culturally in other parts of the globe with 8 billion humans? How do we, I'll keep other animals out of it for now, but we'll just leave it with humans. But, how is it a cultural relative thing, or how is anger universal? How do you look at that? And the example I could say you could introduce here is the two different cultures you provide in the book. I'm going to butcher both their names.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you describe how anger and shame are different in these cultures. So you can maybe use that as the example and set us up, or you can just kind of answer the universality of it.
Well, so again, on the universality question, I think it's fair to say, following the sort of agreement I indicated about there being some kind of circuitry that seems to come with a psychobiological equipment for something in the dispositions to get something in the vicinity of what we call anger. Every culture has a word for anger. Actually, some cultures have lots of words. Some cultures have twice as many words. And it's always interesting when you ask people, you say, okay, anger is universal. Is hatred a kind of anger? And some people say, oh yeah. Some people say, no, I'm just telling you, reporting. Mm-hmm. Or if I say, is irritability anger? You say, yeah, sort of. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. We have all these, we have ways, we've had adjectives that we can modify nouns with, but I think anger is universal. And in fact, it presents universal ecological sort of human ecology problems across cultures. So there turn out to be several cultures still existing, not gone, that think anger is generally very, very dangerous, bad emotion. Children are taught that from the get-go. You see it in children's books. So for example, on wonderful work that Jeannie Tsai, a psychologist at Stanford, has done, she looks at children's books, the top 10 selling children's books across cultures on Amazon. And she actually does Ekman face studies of what faces they're making in different contexts. And she finds that generally Americans make a HAP face, a high arousal positive face for both, now using the valence thing just for positive and negative, the way we were talking about. Or they use high arousal positive faces for positive and negative. A very angry face for angry, and a very happy, shit-eating grin, sort of happy, happy, joy, joy, click your heels face. Mm-hmm. East Asian books, Hong Kong, Taipei, Indonesia, almost always have low arousal positive faces. Mm-hmm. The smile's different. Mm-hmm. Also, in North American children's books, anger is modeled as an appropriate emotion to have when you're frustrated, when a child is frustrated, mm-hmm. but not in East Asian cultures. Mm-hmm. So you start to see the way in which different cultures are giving sometimes overt hints by saying, no, anger is bad, or sometimes just subtle hints about, Jeannie calls them, the ideal emotional self. They're sort of telling you what an emotionally well-balanced person in Taipei is like, mm-hmm. or Hong Kong is like. We might have stories that your patients read to their children in Baltimore, right, mm-hmm. that are different. So I think you'll see different cultures that have theorized anger. Some cultures, the standard way that anthropologists talk about things is that sometimes there's an ethnotheory, a theory that the culture itself has about emotions mm-hmm. that is widely shared in public. Mm-hmm. And they talk about cultures that hypercognize emotions. Mm-hmm. So one of the cultures in which I talk about in the book, the Minangkabau, these are people who live in Indonesia, and they do use shame as a socializing emotion, but they think anger is very bad. Mm-hmm. And they not only use shame, but they also use shaming of children. It's highly ritualized, though, so it's interesting. I mean, it's nothing like we would use shame, but they think of anger as just terrible, as the work of the devil. Mm-hmm. This other culture I talk about, the Bara, Madagascar, agropastoralists, and they use furious anger as a socializing emotion for children. Those would just be, among many, many different examples. There's wonderful books in the anthropological literature, like Jean Briggs' classic book in the 70s on Eskimos, Eskimos, where anger is entirely prohibited. Allegedly, they seem to say you should never feel anger towards other humans, but they're always expressing anger towards their dogs. Mm-hmm. And so you see in cultures like Buddhist cultures, for example, where anger is thought badly of, mm-hmm. That there's a lot of theorizing about the damage it causes. So they're very familiar with it. Mm-hmm. So there's huge cultural variation. And one of the things that I'm interested in is what happens nowadays in multicultures when people with very different norms and scripts for doing anger, land in cities and towns where, when the kinder, gentler Buddhists arrive in Ellis Island, not that people arrive that way anymore the way they used to, but right. When they come in and the Confucians come in and these other people come in, which norms, it's back to old questions about whether we're a melting pot or the mosaic. You might have different communities with different intelligible practices about emotions internal to them. You might have, the Irish Catholics neighborhoods and the Italian Catholic neighborhoods and the Jewish neighborhoods and the Dominican neighborhoods might all have different ways of doing the emotions internal to them. That's a question about which I'm unopinionated, but I think it's a big, it's one of the many problems and interesting questions about how multiculturalism works.
Yeah. So here's my, I'm glad you brought up the two different cultures, because we'll come back to that when we talked about shame just in a minute. So here's my idea about this. Now, I'm not well versed. Number one, I think that we're still in the infancy of looking at emotions in non-weird cultures. So, not, Western culture. Yep. And we're still in that infancy. Much of the time that's hard to do because of, grants and research and money, and, it's tough to do. So it's not because people don't want to do it or they're just ignoring it. It can be difficult. But here's my hypothesis here on this. My hypothesis is we see emotions in other organisms and in other animals. Now, there may be different dimensions or layers to it. We definitely know that chimps and bonobos and other primates have some form of emotions. We know other animals, other mammals have, some type of idea of emotions, how much they, to what extent do they have it like we do is probably less so because of the different brain matter. But with humans, to me, it's not just what makes us human, but I think in the very multiple dimensions in which we can have emotions, I think is something that it is sort of defining for us as humans, right? So many people will overemphasize, I think, our cognitive abilities, right? Our language abilities, which is great. And they underestimate the power of our highly layered and abstract emotional capacity, right? And I think that's just as important, mostly because of what we understand with neuroscience, which says all of it's connected in the brain. You can't, look, we can separate and tease out the cognitive properties, but that doesn't mean that we should put some kind of attribution on this or some judgment to say, and this is higher than the emotional ways of things, because they're interconnected, right? And this is, I think Lisa talks about this, and I firmly agree with her on that. So I'm saying all this because if how people have this layered component of emotions as a human experience, it must be that way, I think, for humans, past, present, and in the future, all around the world, all different cultures. To me, this becomes, the way I frame this is, if you take the phenomenological component to this, which is, what is it like to experience this internally and then with the other? there's something of what it's like to experience that. So that we're talking about distinct subjective experiences that people have in total with other people. But how they do or do not express that will be very different compared to what their norms are, what their culture are, what their history is, what their language is, what their, all of these things. I don't think that it means that they have different emotions, or some people feel this and other people don't. I think the language will be, it will come out, in different ways, right? There's 8 different forms of love for the Greeks, and there's 7 different ways of this for other cultures. That's fine. That's a fine way to do it. When you're looking at those labels, they're trying to explain distinct subjective experiences that people are having. But that doesn't mean that people have it and some people don't. I think what is happening with emotions is that, yes, we may talk about it in different ways, and yes, there may be a certain sense of morals and culture, but there's enough, if you want to call them basic emotions and or social or self-conscious emotions, that I think all humans possess. I do think the expression of that is going to be widely different. And people may disagree with me on that, right? But I can't, there's something enough. So like, again, this is the phenomenological argument, right? If I go to Papua New Guinea, or if I go to, China, or if I go to Bangladesh, or if I go to Paraguay, there's going to be enough there, not cognition only, but the emotional piece of it that is going to say, I know what it's like to have the human experience. You and I are from totally different parts of the world, but we both know what it feels like to have this or this. We might express it differently. We might call it different things. We might prop one of it up and some of it down based on our norms or our morals, but we all know what it's like to have somewhat of a similar analogous human experience. So that's kind of where I stand on it. So I don't know. You tell me your thoughts on whether you disagree with this.
I think that it's a really open question right now. And what was nice about the eloquence and the passion with which you express that view is that it takes us right back to the very beginning of this and actually does get us connected to certain things about sort of definitional issues of the emotions, because you were again sort of expressing the view that what I'll just call the narrow phenomenological experience, that has sufficient similarity across cultures that we're identifying the same thing. Mm-hmm. Of course, what I do, but in culture A, when my daddy dies, I feel the same way as in culture B, but in culture A, I cry, and in culture B, I don't know, I put a blanket over my head and just stare into empty space. Right. And that's good for a view like because you've always been wanting since the beginning of this conversation, you favor more separating out the emotional expression, which I totally get how one could do that. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in the possibility, so I don't have a firm opinion against the view you just expressed. You started out that I'm interested in the possibility that even the feeling states themselves are not identical, despite being willing to agree that there's a deep phenomenological core of similar feelings that these states are built upon. Some of the reasons for that, like you said at the beginning, we're all in the infancy of looking at non-weird cultures. We are in the infancy of looking at non-weird cultures. Non-weird cultures are not in the infancy of looking at themselves.
Fair, absolutely fair. Yes.
So, yes. And what we're starting to see there is more variation all over the place. Now, it's not, the evidence is not in yet completely. I mean, but what we started to see, there's a nice book coming out, and you might want to interview her next, and she's wonderful. A woman I refer to in the book a few times, her Batya Mesquita. She's a Belgian cultural psychologist, and she's working on, has a book coming out soon on emotions. Give you her information.
Yeah.
But I think what we're seeing is something like this, that um, back to a book by Catherine Lutz back in the 1980s. It was called Unnatural Emotions. She's one of the first psychologists to sort of look at other cultures, and some of the evidence is just towards what you said. They get sad too, but they just stop eating when they get sad. We might eat more when we get sad. I don't know. Depends, but there are cultural scripts, but that'd be about what you would call the behavior. But she claims there's one very interesting analysis, and then the question is how much are these multiplied? She claims that when people in the Caroline Islands in the South Pacific fall in love with each other, and they look into their beloved's eyes and they reach the point of saying, I love you, will you marry me, and things like that, their word love is conceptually, but this doesn't just mean it doesn't have affective effects. It's defined as, or characterized by them, maybe this is a better way to put it. It's characterized by them as when I look into my beloved's eyes and marry her, and say, I love you forever, to have and to hold from this day forward. It comes with a feeling of sadness and loss and nostalgia, because their life is very fragile there. And the word phago means we who love each other lose each other. Now that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
As at least a report of their phenomenology. The trouble with doing this kind of work, though, you point to a really big problem, is that even if we want to do this intercultural work, we've got to translate across languages. And eventually we have to settle on saying, I know what you mean by that word is what I mean by love, more or less.
Yeah.
Or what you mean by shame is that word, more or less. And I have looked into this a fair amount in other languages, in Chinese, classical Greek. These words are really the semantic relations of what people, when people are asked to describe their state. You ask a person, are you angry, ira, or are you this other thing, which would be like furious rage, or are you these 10 other things? People become good at, who practice these things, identifying their internal states. And we can definitely see family resemblances with ours, but sometimes they're surprising semantic connections that are surprising to us. And I talk about some of that research, at the beginning of the book, just to sort of set the reader up for the possibility that these things have unusual connections to other emotion concepts.
Well, this reminds me of again, I mentioned her again, Jessica Tracy. She wrote this paper, I'm forgetting the co-author, where they were trying to understand, even within Western culture, weird cultures, is there's too many emotions. There's not that many emotions, right? There's not 75 emotions, right? So how do we develop better and more accurate taxonomies? So maybe compassion is the umbrella group, and then that's empathy, sympathy, loving kindness, etc. That they are, there's subsets, right? There is a difference between them, but they're all subsumed under this one big kind of thing. I would imagine when you're talking about language and how how do we translate across cultures and things like that, as we start to look at, you could create really good measures this way, where you're just saying, describe this, not, is it anger or joy? If people start describing the same kinds of experiences, it would fall out. This is my guess. Oh yeah, you guys call it this. We call it this, but it's the same distinct subjective experience or similar. Okay, and then you can kind of, create a more global kind of taxonomy of human emotion. That's where I would think something like that could occur, but maybe not.
So the expectation would be something like, So like when I was a little boy and we got our first set of Crayola crayons, they're the primary colors. But then you find out when you go to get wallpaper with red or paint that's red, there are 5 bazillion, but they're all varieties of red.
Yes.
And this is the, so I think these are outstanding empirical questions. So my suspicion in relation to your suggestion, I think that we both agree what the procedures would be to figure out intertranslation and stuff. I think that you'll be faced still with these interesting questions of, why does American anger feel like I want to punch you in the nose and Japanese anger feel like I want to leave the room? Because it's reported as part of the feeling of the state, even if you don't do it. So you'll get these I think you will get still brought in what I call some of the things that are what causes the state and dispositions to behavior will be brought in and be variable across cultural situations.
Yeah, yeah.
This is, you've reminded us already, and I say this in the book, psychology is a young science. It's about 150 years old. So, and it's interesting, you must think about this all the time. I see it at my university because I'm a member of the, both the neurobiology department and then psychology and neuroscience. They have very different attitudes to the level at which the mind will be explained. And of course, some of the neurobiologists think, oh, it won't even be in neural terms, it'll be in informational terms, sort of. And then, of course, the psychologists think, no, we'll still hold on to our old folk psychological vocabulary. And then there are the neuroscientists who think maybe not. And boy, it's interesting times.
Yeah. I just want to just add on to something you said, because I also think about this. So I just want to be very clear about this. I'm only aware of where I'm, born and where I've been trained and all that stuff of what we understand about emotions. But I am deeply curious and optimistic about other cultures and how they look at these things. I guess we need to do that work. We need to do that. I'm a big proponent of that kind of stuff. How does emotions look around the world and for different cultures and stuff? I really enjoy that. I guess my kind of unifying thing here is maybe it's more of a desire or wish, but I believe so much in the human spirit that I feel like, yes, the emotions are going to be, there's enough crossover, there's enough universality because of the human aspect of it. And so maybe that's my optimism there, but I do think that. But one piece on this, which you mentioned, which I agree with, is so people like myself and you and other folks, we can debate all this and what's taxonomy and all these things and how do we create measures. But the other piece of this is there is cultures, there is norms, there are things from other places. And what happens when, to use the consciousness raising term, what happens when non-weird and weird people get together in the same community, right? Whether it's a city or a neighborhood or whatever. That's where things get super interesting, right? Because in many ways, a lot of these places are very homogenized, right? You have tribes, they've always been together. They don't even go to, hang out with other tribes. You can say this for folks that, live in certain parts, many Western countries have this kind of dichotomy of like city and rural, right? And we have that version of that. And what happens when people feel, I just immigrated from Kenya, or I immigrated from Jamaica, or I immigrated from, Belarus, and now I'm living in New York, or I'm living in California, in Los Angeles. Whoa, like this is so different from, that is a very tough question. I have no answers to. I mean, that is very difficult to do. And I always just lean on whether it's right or wrong. Whatever country you're in, you got to follow the law for sure, whether you agree with it or not. But then also, this is a separate conversation. It's kind of a footnote. But how do you respect people's cultures and where they come from? But then how do you have I think appropriate or healthy types of acculturation of, and this goes either way, right? If I move to, Japan or, Jordan, I have to do some acculturation. I don't live in the United States anymore. So I have to acculturate a little bit of how they just kind of do things and their norms, and vice versa, I think. So that's another mystery.
And you're right. And to emphasize the point that is, central to your own research is that it's not just a cognitive matter. It isn't like just learning American history. There is a little research that Batya Mesquita has done on this, and she's published about it in a few papers, and I think it's going to be in her book. She has been looking at what happens with immigrant groups that come to Brussels, Belgium, and maybe it's Amsterdam, could be Copenhagen, I forget whether it's Denmark or Holland. And what she and her group has found is that that basically the sort of emotional styles, let's call them emotional styles of these different immigrant groups, like you were describing, when they arrive in Belgium, people are able to, and you probably remember families like this from your childhood. I certainly do. Where the grandma was from the old country. And at home, she made the old country cuisine. She had the old country style. She was, they always loved children, but it was different from my family. So you can maintain these sort of stylistics at your home, but within about 3 generations, she says, they usually get lost in the public sphere.
Yeah.
The dominant culture will usually, and that's where I worry about, frankly, the American style of anger, because I think we model horrendous. I mean, I would like my own children to know, yes, certain norms. Well, they're grown up now, and I think they did learn these, that anger is appropriate only at certain times. And there's always the danger of disrespecting people. Oh, yeah. You need to watch that. And they know that. But I think that there's the public role models for anger now. Basically, it's all holds barred, and it's cruel, it's mean, it's vindictive, it's thoughtless, and it's narcissistic. And that means that as immigrant groups arrive here and learn to acculturate, they're acculturating to what's not the most healthy model of
yes. I would absolutely agree with you there. Okay, so we've talked about kind of emotions in general. We've talked about anger. So now let's get to shame. This is it's kind of a big thing. We could probably spend many hours. I definitely could spend many hours talking about shame. So I guess the first question here, unless there's anything you want to start with, is just kind of how you define the self. Again, that's a really big question, but mostly in terms of global self and particular versions of the self, just kind of the brief version of it before we kind of because that will become important for shame.
Yeah, that'll become very important for shame. And actually, maybe I can tie it in. I'll do it this way, answer your question this way, because I'm happy to talk about the self or the person and the global self. Because it does come up, as you rightly point out in the discussion, shame. But one good example, I was just thinking of a case where, now shame is already interesting, right? Given our discussion so far, because shame does appear on some people's list of basic and universal emotions, not on them all. Actually, guilt doesn't either. But these are, like you said, pride doesn't show up on a face, guilt doesn't necessarily show up on a face, shame doesn't, jealousy. There might be ones that are maybe not. But in any case, components of shame, almost everybody agrees, if shame has components and it's not itself a basic emotion, they are things like sadness and anxiety and fear, which are pretty basic. Okay. But what I was going to say to you was that insofar as you tend more to the side of thinking that there'll be something universal in the description of some emotions across the globe. And I'm a little bit more skeptical, maybe if that's a fair way to describe us. Now, I think shame is more interesting than anger in this regard, because I do think even if cultures think differently of the normative value of anger, they all know what anger is. They kind of describe it the same way. I didn't really say what that was, but it's almost like I got you.
Yeah.
I know it. We know when we see it, and we've all seen it. Shame, though, in my study of other philosophical traditions, including classical Greek and classical Chinese and some contemporary Chinese and contemporary Indian, I do think that there's a big difference, and it relates to this self issue. So people will, Tangney and Deering in 2002, they define shame as the emotion that involves a negative evaluation of the global self. Shame is the emotion that involves a negative evaluation of global self. So I'll say a little bit now what I think they mean and what I think the self is, but I will now say, and it may be more bold than I want to be, that no other culture defines shame that way. Okay. So, all right. So what is a self? Well, in philosophy, we distinguish between lots of different conceptions. But so, one conception of myself is just indexed to, I am the guy who's talking to Xavier right now. And that's a pretty thin, just pointing to this person. But normally when we're interested in the self in psychology or philosophy, we're interested in something like Dan Dennett. he calls it the self, the center of narrative gravity.
Yeah.
It's not everything about myself. Like if you and I have just met, in fact, we just have, and we're learning about each other. And were we to be able to spend time together over time, I would tell you about the times that I coached Little League Baseball and how important that was to me and how important my grandma was to me and stuff like that. But what I had for breakfast wouldn't come up. So I would sort of focus in on aspects of myself, my character, traits I have, interests I have, passions I have, loved ones I have that are essential in my autobiography. And then there'd be, so I take it that the self is some kind of construct. It's closely aligned with our autobiographical self. And we can be mistaken about who we are, self in that sense, right? I might, in fact, almost certainly when we tell a story of ourselves or narrate a story of ourselves, there's a fair amount of self-serving spin. I want you to like me, not necessarily, I'm going to tell things and I might believe them in the sort of favorable ways that I tell them. But I take it that, so the kind of self that, if one were talking about the global self, I take it that would be the identification of something like my main character traits, my main interests and my main passions and my main relationships. And they would constitute my identity. That we'd say, these are the things I'm so attached to that if I lose them, I lose part of myself as the person I am. So that's just sort of like not quite an operational definition, but that's sort of the sense of I have of what it means to be a self or a person. Now, I take it in, so one idea in the shame literature is that, and that comes out in at least, some of what I've read in the Anglophone literature is that shame is defined as this negative evaluation of my global self, the person who I am. And all I was going to say to just start this is when I look at other cultures, especially the culture in which there's the most ethno-theorizing about shame is Chinese culture historically. And we even have Chinese culture going back much longer than we have Greek culture going back. So we have great, what we would now call philosophers, psychologists, economists, political scientists from ancient times. And there's an awful lot of discussion about how shame works, what it is, how a mature sense of shame should be built in children. It's built in terms of a sense of righteousness, things that a good person ought not to do. And the child is generally told to feel shame, never about her whole self, but only about things that are under her control that she can not do in the future. And if she doesn't learn to not do those things in the future, then she should feel ashamed of herself for not doing, for that aspect of herself. So that was sort of where I started out with this sort of concern as I looked into the literature about the way in which shame was characterized. And I can see how if one has a view that shame is the emotion that involves a negative evaluation of the global self, then a negative evaluation of the global self is an absolutely terrible thing to have. There's got to be a variety of shame, or call it something else, self-loathing, I don't know, that is that state. But I guess I just wanted to say across other traditions, it's not garden variety shame in those other traditions. So that was where I sort of
that's helpful. So I will I think it's difficult. So I will grant you the global self. I'm more agnostic about that than I was maybe 10 years ago. Right. I think maybe shame is really difficult because I'm trying to figure out the order if I want to say this. Shame is difficult because you definitely have morals, you definitely have norms, cultural norms, and you definitely have the sense of self. Even for someone like for me, I'm not too shy about thinking that maybe the self is an illusion, right? that doesn't bother me, right? That's something that is entertaining for me to think of and say that may be very true. And yet, something may be true, but people do not function or act in the world as in the way in which that's true. So people don't walk around the world thinking like myself is an illusion. They walk around with a certain, kind of heuristic of what that is. Okay, fine. So yes, I think maybe I would be willing to concede that in terms of, based on what we understand from other cultures, that the idea of the global self, the total summation of all of your parts as being less than, right? Or kind of the definition of shame there is probably not accurate. I would say shame as having a part of the self more accurate, I would say. I think the global self is a kind of catch-all that says me, right?
That's right.
I don't know, right? Because so this happens in the United States all the time, Western culture. Someone does something, right? They do an indiscretion, right? You see this all the time. People get canceled, all this stuff, right? Yeah. They do something wrong. They do something wrong, not even by our norms, just in general, right? You don't kill your relative or something, right? Because they did whatever thing, and then people would say that's a horrible person, right? We should shame this person. We shouldn't interact with them. Even if there's a part of you that does something that is shame worthy, let's say, right? Or is prone to some type of shame there. So we use those words. It may not be true, and I don't think it is true of the global self. It's not all parts of themselves, but it will significantly have a ripple effect and impact the other parts of yourself. Yeah. And so, if I do something wrong at my job, I might feel a sense of shame. Yeah. I feel bad about that. I feel I'm a kind of a bad person. Does that mean that I feel shame about myself as a parent? Yeah, probably not. Probably not. Yeah. But could that have ripple effects? Sure. Depending on what it is and all these things.
Could it seep into the rest of your,
Yeah. And I think really the self, again, that's very hard. Because for me, from my perspective, right, the psychology of this is you have things like personality, you have things like temperament, you have things like style. There's all of these things that are kind of at the core of what it means to be a person, right? I don't buy into this Dennett's idea of it's okay, I guess, but it's one of those things. I get what he's meaning by it because we all kind of operate that way, but I don't think there's us and then there's a person in the center of us that's driving the car. I don't think that exists, right? I don't. All of the parts of us is us, right? It's that whole thing, and so it's the parts from the whole kind of gestalt kind of aspect of things, and so I do think shame could potentially be updated. I'd have to look more into it, but to say yes, you can have shame about aspects of yourself, and that would be a definition. But, and this is where the norms kind of come in, which is hard, is there are some things, for example, if one person is a pedophile, that is complete total shame of that entire person in society. I've worked with these individuals at a certain time. It is all of them. That is a stain. Like you can't, that is the ultimate shame, right? And many folks that are that way, they feel like they can't control it. I don't know why I have these impulses. I don't want to have them. I want to get better, and I still have them. And that would be an example of, you could say like, yeah, I'm a janitor, but if people know that aspect, or if I know that aspect, just the whole aspect of me feels shame, right? that does implicate in terms, I think, again, this starts to get really branch out of, well, is that just how we are in the West? We just, have, that's like, ground zero for like, we just don't tolerate that. I don't think that that's entirely a acceptable norm in other cultures either. I don't know all cultures, but so I don't know, right? I think this stuff is really complicated in terms of even an operational definition of shame, of terms of, well, how do we understand, is it the global self? Maybe for certain components of things in life. I don't know. I would think more so for folks, it is these kind of distinct pieces of the self, right? I think that's true. So, okay. So connecting with what you're saying with cultures. Yeah, I think, my loose reading of it, of shame in other cultures is there is something about the experience of that wanting to feel like you want to crawl into the hole in the ground because you did something. Maybe for some cultures, they were dishonorable. That's a big thing for some cultures. Well, that would be shame, right? They're shameful. Do some places put a positive or negative valence on that? Okay, well, that's a separate question, but do they have the experience of that? Okay. I think that there is enough universality in shame. I think it's extremely complicated because it has to do with the self, it has to do with culture, it has to do with norms. So it's just really hard. But I think it is something that has maybe it is the emotion that has the most variance, right? Maybe it has the most parts to it. I don't know. But I'm willing to concede that it might be better with exceptions to think of shame not as a global self, but as maybe one or two or three parts of yourself. So I would concede that.
What do you think about? One sort of I think it's you raise these cases. There have got to be cases, as I said, even on the view that shame is the emotion that involves, disvaluing the global self. And by the way, in using Dennett, I wasn't ascribing to any particular view about when I think of the self as a fiction. I don't think a fiction is a bad thing. I think it's just that, what we call ourself is the crucial traits of the person that we are, that we would feel that we were no longer the same person in some relevant sense were we to lose them. So there are, they constitute our powerful identifications, and they include some things which are we don't have control over, too much, like our temperament, personality, body. Like you said. But they are ours. But one of the things that led me to think about things differently about shame was that I was worried, and you talk about this and talked to me a little bit about this before in our email. So I just realized that there was this pop cultural industry about. It does seem like a pop cultural industry to me, like, because usually when I talk to women in particular, they would tell me, "Oh my God, shame is the worst thing. It leads to eating disorders." And then I sort of got, well, yeah, if you shame women about their body, I could see how it could cause body disorder. And a body is so fundamental that it could seep. I like that sort of way I forget if you use that word or something close to it. You could say, well, I'm not just my body, but then again, it's sort of what people seem to notice about me. I'm 21 years old and people pay a lot of attention to that. And then they're telling me what it should be like. And I could see how that could take over personality. I was struck though, Xavier, by the fact that at least when people study the words shame and guilt and how they're introduced to kids in America, I found some really interesting stuff. And I just wonder what you're thinking about this is. So parents very often do tell their children in Anglophone families, you ought to be ashamed for not sharing with your sister. They actually almost never say you ought to feel guilty about not sharing with your sister, which is kind of interesting to me, because they're really calling upon the child to act in a certain way. So if we say, as you pointed this out earlier, one standard sort of dictionary distinction that people make between shame and guilt is about the actions or the deeds in the doing part. And you go to the priest and you confess your sins, which are the things you did. Shame is inner, you keep it in, you can't get rid of it exactly in the same way. But the language of shame and guilt are used sort of almost equally, according to at least a lot of the child development literature I've read, are introduced in, and they're used sometimes. Both of them can be used for I'm ashamed of the action I did, or I feel guilty for the action I did, and as well as for character traits. I feel so guilty that I always want to get more money. So it looks as if, at least in America, we're no longer distinguishing very clearly those two emotions. And that seems to be an interesting task that is really good, ripe for interdisciplinary study. They get the psychologists, the philosophers, the linguists, and the anthropologists together and say, what's going on? Are we seeing like a semantic shift, a bundling of just a whole set of things into an incoherent bundle, or is it more coherent? I don't know what to make of it quite at this point in time.
Well, this is my soapbox, so I don't want to get on it. So I have very strong opinions. For folks that know me, I'm the centrist, moderate, whatever person, and everyone's always bugging me because I'm both siding things, which I don't. But I feel strongly about this. Yes, I think most of the discussion in pop psych and in society and how they talk about shame is completely uninformed, and most of it is absolute fucking bullshit. And it makes me angry because, much like you describe in the book, which I like, is we can have a sense of mature sense of shame. Excuse me. We should not, and we cannot, because it's inaccurate, and I don't think it's helpful. And I think it's inadvertently dangerous and harmful to people to go around telling them that they need to get rid of their shame, as if they can get rid of a human emotion, right? Yeah. Or whatever that experience is, Shame has, and there's plenty of stuff in the literature that shows adaptive qualities. Now, you could make the argument of how much of that should you have, how much adaptive shame, how often, how frequent. Fair enough. That is a fair thing to debate in the literature. But to say that an emotion, you need to make yourself vulnerable and get rid of your shame is just horseshit. That's not true. That's not true. Right. And especially because the emotion of shame has elements to do with how you view yourself. So you're saying there's parts of yourself in terms of how you feel that you have to get rid of? Yeah. That's ridiculous. So yeah, I will keep going on and on. So I will stop there on that part, but just tell us real quick because I really liked in the book your idea of the mature sense of shame and how you think about it in sort of these kinds of ways it could be adaptively used or used in a more efficient way.
Yeah. And let me say one thing that I appreciate very much the way you were saying about the positive uses of shame. I didn't, one of the reasons I got interested in shame a while ago, actually, like you were saying about, various therapeutic communities. I myself was alcoholic. Some people who were alcoholic will say they are alcoholic. I just would say I was alcoholic, but I know I'm vulnerable to drinking, and I don't drink. But I was very much struck when I first went to Alcoholics Anonymous, 20 years ago, or even longer than that ago, by the strict indoctrination that this is a disease and one ought not to feel, and then fill in the blank. Sometimes they would say shame, and sometimes they would say guilt, but usually they would say shame. And, and so my reaction was somewhat like yours. Well, no, I'm a person with some standards for how I want to live my life. And if I'm not, as it were, showing up for my life in the ways that I think I ought to show up for my job, for my family, for my children, for my relationships, or abiding by my own standards, then it's appropriate that I feel shame. It isn't like, people will always want to draw these analogies. They say, well, being alcoholic or being a drug addict is like having cancer. Well, it's like having some kinds of cancer, maybe like lung cancer from smoking, and you can give up smoking. The analogies are just too simplistic sometimes, and the advice to get rid of the shame is too simplistic also. And in my own case, I found my sense of shame was what kept me going, trying every tactic I could to get out this, and it was a powerful trait of myself. It was there. It was pretty overpowering, but I had to work around it, and my sense of shame was motivating. I didn't like it one bit. that I woke up every day ashamed. But I climbed that mountain, and the shame was motivating. So now the mature sense of shame. Thank you for asking about that. So this is where I thought I could make a contribution, because I thought that first of all, and this is an esoteric philosophical point, but when philosophers or theologians look at the concept of conscience, which you might say, we all talk about people that, we want people to have a strong moral compass, we say, or we expect people, we say things like, where did his conscience go? Well, conscience has a history, and it has a history mostly inside the Abrahamic traditions. And it has to do with, it's a faculty where you're responsive to God's will, as it were. And you've internalized God, the legislator, into your life. You could even, by the Freudian view, God, the legislator, becomes your father becomes your boss, et cetera. And many people think that guilt is the mechanism of conscience, and many people analyze guilt as anger turned inward. So then anger is doing a lot of work in your morality. Well, what happens when people live in cultures which are more and more secular, when there isn't a God to legislate your conscience or to help you develop a moral compass? Well, one possibility is that you then have to depend more than before on the traditions, the healthy traditions inside your culture, to create in you a sense of what's right and wrong. And that's really pretty much the way, for example, just to pick one tradition, but there are many like this, inside classical Confucian tradition, that a mature sense of shame works. You learn from, you're not born in the world knowing that you should share with your sister the M&Ms. You're not known that you will have more fun with the toys if you play together on the toys. And eventually that will lead to playing multi-person games, and that'll be a lot of fun in any human life. If you can walk, you can learn to tango and cha-cha, and these are all various ways to dance and do things with other people, and they're governed by norms. And so a lot of sort of the work that some people say makes shame a, as it were, primitive motion. Some people, philosophers, will say it's very primitive because it doesn't involve like really serious transcendental foundations. It just involves social customs and habits. Well, social customs and habits have their warrant, and sometimes they are based on really long, good histories about what we call morality, also what we call etiquette. But they allow us to make ourselves legible to each other and lead good human lives. So what I call the mature sense of shame is just what an adult human being is supposed to have. There's certain things that one learns one ought to do. For example, good cultures teach that if you're a public servant, you should serve the public. If you're a public servant, you should tell the truth. And a powerful sense of shame would lead people to have expectations of each other, that we could count on each other to be doing those sorts of things. So what I have in mind for a mature sense of shame is simply an internalized set of values which you're attached and then become part of, in a way, your global self. They are the things which, if you don't enact them or you don't abide by them, you will feel ashamed. And sometimes, of course, you'll be tempted for all kinds of reasons that are just sort of part of being a human being, to say, lie, cheat, or steal. But if you have a good sense of shame, you might not do that. And it might, so the idea is just that in a mature sense of shame doesn't involve you being ashamed. It just involves you being aware that you would be ashamed were you to do what goes against your values. That's the rough idea.
Yeah. And this is, for another conversation, but I mean, I'm always reminded of, kind of Nietzsche's point of, God's dead and we've killed him. And the point of that is that, he rightly stated, almost in a prophetic way, the shadow of God always looms over humans in society. And when you don't have that, you have to have this revaluation of all values, right? And how do you create that? And that is really difficult. That is extremely difficult. And obviously he was very condemning about Christianity for the dogma, and rightly so. But there was this thing of like, holy shit, this is like a big void to fill. How do you do that? It's almost mission impossible. And so very difficult. And so I kind of what you're saying, how do we develop this kind of internal kind of, moral compass, right? And how do we have this mature sense of shame is a challenge.
Yeah. And the Nietzschean point is well taken. That's exactly one of the things I think about in this, because, we have people, in most of the countries in Northern Europe now, more than 60% of the people are non-believers. Right. And, in fact, what do they call nuns? I think they call it, people who don't believe in any, not nuns of the habit. Right. So that's the largest growing group. So Nietzsche's prediction would be there will be an age of nihilism because people won't know what to do once they lost their moral foundations. And so what I like about shame is insofar as it's social, it's seriously social. It says something like, Confucius says, every once in a while, we have to rectify the names. We have to take back the word leader and attach it to people who lead. We have to take civil servant and attach it to people who are civil servants. We have to demand, and that's a social demand. It's a demand for convivial living together maybe in a godless world. That's...
I totally agree with you on that, and that's the challenge. Well, look, Owen, you've been generous, more than generous with your time. The book is called How to Do Things with Emotions: The Morality of Anger and Shame Across Cultures. I highly recommend it, and it's fabulous. Owen, where can people get the book? Where can they find your research and find you online?
They can get the book at Princeton University Press or on Amazon. I won't... but it's being sold on Amazon, and it's on a Kindle version as well as, and Princeton University Press did a nice job of pricing it for academic book reasonably. So, and my research it's on my website at Duke.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for coming on. This was a really, really fun conversation. I really, really enjoyed all of our going back and forth and trying to just kind of think out loud and figure these things out.
To a leading expert on shame.
I wouldn't go that far.
No, it just makes for a wonderful conversation for me, intellectually absorbing and exciting. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.